Welcome to today's information session. Before we start, a reminder that this workshop is being recorded. While this workshop is open to the public, it is for staff to provide guidance to elected members, not a forum for debate or decisions. It is also not a forum for the public to provide input into decisions or bring other matters to our attention. If a member of the public does want to provide input, please talk to staff and help them say. So right now we've got Mark and Rohan. Who talk to us about the resource management national direction packages.
Great. So today we're here to explain to you the draft submission that we've prepared on the national packages of direction that has been released by central government. The packages that we're discussing today traverse infrastructure, the primary sector, and fresh water. There's a fourth package known as going for housing growth, which we'll come back to you separately on, and that is subject to a separate timeline from the consultation on these three packages. The submission that we've prepared will be circulated to you later today and after this session, obviously. So we welcome any written feedback that you've got in advance of it coming to council. I should also add that these packages of national direction are separate from the replacement of the RMA, which will land the end of this year, and also separate from current amendments that are going through Parliament on changes to the RMA to opt out of MDRS.
Can you please repeat what's contained in this?
So there's three packages covered: enabling infrastructure, enabling the primary sector, and freshwater management.
Thank you.
We'll get on to that.
Okay.
So
in the housing one?
that will come later.
That would be my first though. Why separate that one? So
I'll just briefly, the consultation period on these three packages came out before the package on housing for growth, and therefore given the same amount of time, but it's slightly delayed. So invite today your feedback on the council's the positions that we'll explain to you now. And this is ahead of going to the Finance Performance Committee on the 3rd of June for approval of that submission. So in terms of overall feedback, just to summarise what the themes are across the three packages, we recognise and welcome the more enabling approach, and that can bring obviously benefits for growth and communities. We also support greater recognition of natural hazards in the national direction. It's the first time that we've seen a national policy statement on natural hazards to guide our decision making. But it's always about, there is some imbalance that we're concerned about in terms of the packages. The imbalance in terms of taking away the ability for councils to tailor rules to their individual communities. Secondly, the imbalance insofar as the direction is very enabling of growth and development, which is at risk of coming at the expense of good environmental outcomes. The slide just sets out the instruments or national direction that is proposed, and I won't repeat that, which we covered in an information session on the 17th of June. Now, in terms of package one on infrastructure and development, the imbalance that I described just before is reflected in this national policy statement. We are supportive of the intent, but feel that the balance isn't right. Now, in terms of the scope of what this policy statement covers, it defines what infrastructure is covered, but we're seeking clarity and additions to what infrastructure is enabled under this policy statement to include green infrastructure, so the likes of parks, street trees, wetlands, community facilities, as well as coastal protection works. This policy statement could aid any resource consent process for council in advancing works within parks, for instance, or coastal protection works. So we're trying to recognise that this policy statement will provide some assistance as well to council. Notwithstanding this, we do have some concern with the way in which the policy statement has been drafted, and Policies, I should have said at the outset too that this is a policy statement, so it's at a policy level rather than prescribing rules. Those policies are considered when we process a resource consent application, or when we do a plan change to the district plan, we consider those policies and go through a weighting exercise to balance those different policies. In terms of those policies, we have got some concern about the imbalance. For instance, there's a policy about providing for the benefits of infrastructure. We have a concern about a policy that's focused on the benefits without recognising that we should also manage the effects of that infrastructure on the environment. Secondly, there's a policy about mitigating effects on the environment, with the caveat that that mitigation has to be cost effective and proportionate to the effects. Now, there's some validity in the level of mitigation being proportionate to the effects arising, but we're concerned that that provision could give rise to circumstances where infrastructure provider says, the mitigation is beyond what is reasonable in terms of costs to provide to mitigate, say, effects on a wetland or effects on a river. And that could mean that the mitigation's enabled but doesn't do enough to mitigate the effects on that river or wetland. That costs would be a reason that infrastructure provider says, I can't provide that, the level of mitigation that's appropriate. Thirdly, there's policy about new infrastructure and upgrades to major infrastructure, and the policy statement expresses avoid where practical, mitigate where avoid where practical, remedy where practical, and mitigate where practical. So if it's not practical, you don't potentially have to do any of it, and that could give rise to adverse effects. We point to the Resource Management Act, where it's clearly stated that effects should be avoided, remedied, or mitigated without any caveat around practicality. The second instrument I just want to touch on is the proposed changes to a national environmental standard for electricity networks. This is so the difference between a policy statement that I described before and this, which are standards. Those standards are effectively rules like our district plan rules. So the standards effectively, upon this coming into effect, would be applied in the same way that district plan rules are applied.
Is there a hierarchy?
Not between the policy statements and the standards,
Yeah.
but effectively the standards should be supported by a policy statement that sits above it. Now, this environmental standard exists at the moment, but they're proposing a change in the name of it. The two key changes that are proposed for this standard at the moment, it only applies to Transpower's network, the national grid. It's proposed that this is also applied to enable activities that Orion undertake, as well as others around the country of a similar setup to Orion. The other key change is that enables EV charging infrastructure to be established as a permitted activity. That enablement is good, and we support that in the submission, but there's a concern about enabling as a permitted activity within the road corridor where it could be adjacent to a residential property. So, for instance, if there were car parks adjacent to a residential property and a provider wanted to put an EV charging station next to those car parks to support charging of those vehicles, if that's outside a residential property, then it could give rise to effects on that residential property if there's cars always coming and going to.
But we've had that raised on inner city apartments that people want to be able to do this out in front of apartments.
So
like we've seen the pictures of extension cords running out the street.
So that relates to, I mean, with the change 2 or 3 years ago to remove car parking standards from our district plan and all district plans around the country, we can't require spaces on site for charging, and that will remain an issue. So, I mean, there's.
Would we allow it in the inner city, for instance, or in high density areas, medium density?
I mean, the submission could express, if that's the position we want to take, that we should enable that outside residential properties. We just want there to be some standards to manage the effects of that on those properties. At the moment, there's no proposed standards. It's just permitted without any mention of how the effects are addressed. The next one's the National Environmental Standards for Telecommunication Facilities. And again, we support the principle of this. It seeks to simplify some of the existing standards that apply for cell phone towers and the like. The clarity of what the maximum height is and what the maximum width is of a mast is welcomed, because at the moment there's not that clarity in those standards. There's also greater consistency in this proposed standard between an existing pole and a proposed pole. But like other matters I've raised, we do have some concerns. So this proposed standard is more enabling of a mast to be in the road reserve outside of residential property. The proposed height limit for a mast out in that circumstance is 20 metres with a width of 0.9 metres, so just under a metre width. And that could be perceived as bulky and visually dominant on those residential neighbours. There's also, over and above that 20 metre height limit, it could go an extra 5 metres above that to 25 metres in height if it's providing for more than 2 operators on that mast. So they're seeking to encourage co-location of facilities from multiple providers on the same mast, which means there's fewer masts in the street. That can be a benefit, but conversely, greater height can also lead to an adverse effect. So we have a concern about the bulky nature of what's enabled outside of residential properties. We welcome the enablement of masts, but want to ensure that any provision to allow for greater scale is in the right places.
Does that affect Christchurch?
Aren't
all our lines one company?
No, there's multiple. So this is about cell phone towers.
That's one. That's
Yeah.
right.
Sorry, the previous slide, this one here was about Orion network, but this one's about telecommunications.
The picture's pylon.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, the picture's misleading.
So Mark, is there any requirement for them to make reasonable efforts to try and locate away from residential property?
Nothing that comes from this document that we've read, but certainly we can make that.
Because this is an issue that we hear from residents quite frequently. They've just got no room to move.
Certainly aware of the issue you've brought to our attention on that.
So, Mark, is there likely to be any retrospective sort of consolidation of current cell phone towers? Because I noticed in my area, they're all over the place. But because of the regulations, some companies have actually put them up right in the heart of subdivisions rather than around the edges.
Yeah, I mean, there's
Which they're legally able to do.
with the upgrade to 5G, obviously they've had to, in some cases, replace masts, provide taller masts. There's also in the discussion document recognition that with increasing heights of development, the masts have to go higher if people want to have coverage. And that's that balance that we need to recognise, that we need to enable masts in order for people to have what they expect in the way of cell phone coverage. But conversely,
Currently, they're not sharing poles. Each company has their own one.
there are shared poles, but there's also poles that individual providers have of their own. So it's a mixed bag. But what this national standard is seeking to do is encourage co-location, but in doing so to provide greater height to allow for more antenna on the top. So each provider will have their own antenna, and if you have more pole height, then you can add more antenna.
The differences between Australia and New Zealand. So in Australia, it's absolutely standard to have a number of providers on one pole. And there's rules to that. Some of the poles in rural are huge, like monsters, but in the like Manly, etc., they use one space and they've got every provider you can imagine. So what's the difference between their legislation and ours? Because there seems to be no kind of option, but the providers have to allow space for each other to use it. So that'll be interesting, because at the moment it seems that our providers, I don't have any faith in them looking out for the community. They want to put it where it's the cheapest product. But secondly, they just seem not to want to share. So that's something that we need to force, but this legislation, again, misses it totally.
Yeah, I can't. We haven't done a comparison with the Australian regulatory framework.
Because if we are able as a city to turn around, so well, we are going to require our network providers to share towers, Is that something that we would be able to do?
We can look at it and consider what, if anything, there is to encourage to require multiple providers to be on the same poles, and suggest that to the central government.
Because overseas, the poles are actually, many of the poles, and they are big companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, actually own towers and lease space to the providers. And it doesn't seem to be the case here.
It's sensible, doesn't it?
Well,
Yeah.
our family's been involved in it, so, you know.
Carry on, Mark.
Someone.
The next international,
Talk about the roading authority, given that we've got control over the roading corridor one.
Have we?
yeah.
Yes.
No, we haven't. Yes, we have.
So,
Maybe have, sorry.
So if there's a safety issue, so let's say there's something going in an intersection that we know is a really hazardous intersection, and it's been identified by us, and the placement of a pole, wouldn't be great because of those safety hazards. Do we have the ability to push back from a safety perspective?
yeah, so regardless of this national instrument that would enable it in the context of the RMA, we still have powers under other legislation to reject.
Thank you.
The scope of what's assessed in terms of what council considers as road controlling authority, it may have open scope to reject it for any reason, but what may go under the radar is the effects on a residential property that's really the domain of the resource management system, and would give us some scope to consider those effects.
So Mark, when a cell phone tower appeared across the road from my house and the neighbours got upset, we found that it was a national law that allowed them to put cell phone towers wherever they felt fit, and there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. Although council could have rejected the consent, isn't that right, John? But we would have been very hard to defend.
Yeah.
So this national standard's an existing standard, which is proposed to be amended for this package, and that the same standard is what you're referring to. Yeah.
Mark, before you go on, Yanni's got his hand up. You there, matey?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I just wanted to, I guess, echo some of the comments and concerns that have been raised. As someone who's dealt with where these towers go, if you want a really good example, Gloucester Street and Fitzgerald Ave, or the Firefighters Reserve down Kilmore Street, we had no ability to have any control, both for amenity, safety. I mean, Gloucester Fitzgerald, you've got a whole bunch of kids going to the school, and the footpath width is so narrow because of the obstruction of the cell phone tower, and yet apparently we didn't have enough ability to say no. So I think we do need to actually push back on this. We actually need better controls. I totally agree with the call that they should share towers. That was something I tried to get council to submit on when they were looking at the 5G and the amendments that were going up into Parliament. But I mean, ultimately what we would want as a city is to have like the broadcast network, is have one network operator, and then the companies just lease off that infrastructure. So whether or not we could make that point in our submission, to me it seems immensely sensible. It limits the number of towers that's needed, because companies will have to use the same one, and it actually gives the government some revenue, and actually it makes a lot of sense from the environmental and amenity control issues. So just
Yanni,
back on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
So what he's saying is not just the road resume adjacent to residential zones, but the effect on the road network and footpath.
Well, that we shouldn't support the standards being simplified. We should actually support them being more enabling of councils having control, or communities having an input.
Okay, we've got
Fair Major.
Andre's got his hand up. Do you want to? How much further have you got?
We've got one or two more slides on this package. We can take some further questions on this package.
We'll do Andre, and then I'll let you get on with, because that might be pertinent to what you're done with this. Okay, thank you. Carry on, mate.
The next one's national standards on granny flats, minor residential units, and this has been out for consultation as a principle earlier in the year. Firstly, we are proposing in our submission a name change to not refer to granny flats, because it's for more than just grannies.
Grandfathers.
Secondly, The proposed maximum limit of a granite flat is 70 square metres. We're asking for clarification of what's within that 70 square metres, so it's not clear if it includes decks, garage, other aspects. Also seeking that we do have scope to consider requirements for outdoor living space and access requirements in any granny flat. The proposal is that we can't require outdoor living space or consider what effects are on access and transport.
They're only grannies.
And fourthly, that another submission point is that if a granny flat's put on the same property as the main house, that the main house still has to comply with other rules in our district plan, including outdoor living space and so forth. So that's a snapshot of our points on that.
Just on the point you made before, it's more than granny, so anybody.
Yeah, that's right.
Could be student rental, could be anything.
You don't
Yeah.
have to have an affiliation with the main house. You wouldn't necessarily get any benefits of the outdoor.
So and it's
But I think the main thing you're saying there, Mark, is that if the granny flat, for one of the better word, can go on there, it mustn't upset the footprint of the original house. You can't just slam it right up against the back of the original house. And
yeah, there's a setback required between the main house and the flat, but also putting if the main house needs, say, 30 square, if there's a need for 50 square metres of outdoor space, that they don't just put the granny flat on what would be the outdoor space.
yeah, that's okay.
The next standards on enabling Papakāinga, and this is to achieve national consistency. District plans vary in terms of how enabling they are. Our district plan is more at the more enabling end in terms of Papakāinga within the Papakāinga Nohoanga zone. But there are some points of consistency, and also the scope of this Papakāinga set of standards does go beyond Māori purpose zones to include rural zones and residential zones. So we just want to ensure there's appropriate standards that are consistent. We also want to have some further guidance from central government on, and that on the one hand, we want to enable Papakāinga, but we don't want to put Papakāinga at risk of natural hazards, for instance, coastal erosion or inundation. So we want some guidance on how we balance those two.
Mark, are we aligned with the local Mana on what we see in this?
We've been liaising with our treaty relationships team and council, but we've gone to Mahanui to seek input.
Yeah, we've seen a draft submission, and our understanding is on some of these issues we are trying to understand what their alignment is, so those conversations are happening.
I haven't had a chance to read through everything. One of the things about the granny flats, minor dwellings, was whether we would have to be told whether they pay DCs and things for connecting to networks. What's the legislation currently saying?
So we can still require development contributions.
Yeah. How do we know that they're doing the development that they're keeping in, right?
So a separate submission we've made in the context of the changes to the Building Act picks up on that point of the risk of us not being notified and there needing to be a mechanism to notify us. So
is it worth reinforcing at the time?
we can do.
Yeah.
It's not addressed in the standard, but we can reaffirm that.
Yeah.
Because it's really in the Building Act that we'd address that.
Are the DCs treated by the number of sinks?
Forget about the number of
Sinks, right?
in terms of charges.
It's a residential unit, which I think can be a indication of another unit.
Right.
It's not a sink. It's not a sink.
Carry on, please.
The national policy statement, so just reaffirming this is about policies rather than the rules. This is a first of national direction on natural hazards for plan making. We support the principle of the proposed national policy statement, but we've got a concern it's not directive enough and tells us what we're doing anyway. In that regard, the national policy statement proposes that councils take a risk-based approach. We do take a risk-based approach, which means that the greater the risk, the more restrictive we can be, the lesser the risk, the more enabling we can be. that is common practice, whether it's rockfall, flooding, or other hazards that we manage at the present time. Although, in this regard, it provides a framework that we can use to implement plan change on coastal hazards, for instance. Interestingly, the national policy statement defines what is deemed significant risk, and it then categorises that as including areas of very high risk, and medium risk. We've got a question around whether medium risk is appropriate to call out as significant risk, especially if with significant risk there's an expectation that there's greater restrictions on development. We don't think that's necessary in some circumstances, so we're questioning that. We also have a question of clarification. The national policy statement talks about rebuilding and replacement of buildings, as well as new development, and that we can assess the risks of natural hazards when there's a rebuild or a replacement of a building. We're seeking clarity on that because it's a question of whether we can apply this direction or and whether that trumps existing use rights that development may already have. Overall, because we're already taking a risk-based approach, it doesn't necessarily, this document doesn't necessarily help us in making the difficult calls in high-risk areas, so we'd be looking for greater direction in this document. With time, I'll pass on to Rohan, who'll talk about the second package of primary sector.
I've just got one on the clinic, but yeah, before we go,
Yeah.
And then I'll do one as well.
So just around that, I'm just trying to understand. So we talked about almost restricting the ability to put them on if they don't meet the outdoor requirements of the existing house.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I guess I'm slightly uncomfortable with that, given it doesn't have, it's a bit different to sort of the MDRS and things like that have been pushed through, because this doesn't really have a bearing on the neighbours. This is sort of someone making a choice on their own land with what they do. So I'm just trying to understand why we would do that.
I mean, we still anticipate that the primary occupants of the house, the main house, still have a level of outdoor space they can use and amenity. They may rent that secondary unit out to someone else, and granted they may forego the benefit of the outdoor space by putting that unit on, but it's subsequent owners as well that have to bear that.
But that'll affect their value and everything anyway. So I'm just trying to understand why we would tell them how to do that, because I personally don't think we should be in the submission.
We've got people living under bridges, indoor space to live.
I mean, that question applies to any, in our district plan, we've got standards for outdoor space with any development. If we're saying that in the circumstances where a granny flat goes on a property secondary to a house, if we're not concerned about outdoor space in that context, it brings into question why we require outdoor space with any development.
Our district plan.
Yeah.
What we're saying is, given this is an enabling piece of work, whereas to get what a smaller housing for potentially individuals or things like that, effectively saying it would be the choice of the house owner because it doesn't impact anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, we can consider that point.
Well, I guess I'm just saying I'd be very hard to support a submission that puts more restrictions around something that's meant to help with smaller housing that doesn't impact neighbours. Oh, I might be alone if I don't. No, it's not. Yeah.
But you're saying that we seek an approval to do that, which is against our district plan.
Yep.
So would that require?
It's that.
What's the question?
Would if we followed that path, would it require us to change our district plan?
No, but if we're saying that someone's outdoor space on their property can be a lot smaller, it brings into question having that standard in our district plan.
I'm saying, would we have to change it?
No, I mean it wouldn't be directed that we change it, but it would lead to an inconsistency in the approach.
Can I just check though, because there's some stuff around permeability of services which impacts beyond the boundary. So if too much of a section is built on, for example, and then you've got, not the
Outdoor water systems.
Yeah, that's that.
I mean,
the permeability and the storm and stuff.
Outdoor space also provides that amenity function, but it also supports stormwater management by having an area to drain runoff from the roof or from hard standing areas. So the risk of building on too much of a site is that you end up with increased stormwater runoff from the property and that giving rise to local surfacing, surface flooding issues.
Just to flag, given it's coming to finance performance, which we're chairing, we'll need to put this bit separately then if there's different use.
Yeah.
So we need to have that as an option, because I can't see why we would restrict it, given it's meant to be enabling.
But only some.
Yeah.
And we can give some more thought to the concerns that you're raising as well.
Yeah.
See, because the government are saying, let's try and do this, and here we are saying, well, maybe, you know. Timothy.
Yeah, thank you. Just with, when we started around the environmental and mitigation costs, is there any timeline of future vision? Because it just seems that when we say infill or develop an area, the environmental costs, as we see down the line, as this builds up through the city, we've spent a fortune on flood planning, etc. But this could almost undermine it because of, and I don't want to pick on developers, but anything could turn around and say, well, to mitigate this cost at the moment is unacceptable, so we'll allow it to happen and the council can sort it out later on. So we're left in the future problems that we've had vision of. The ratepayers will be cost the ratepayers. They'll be paying for a short-term vision of development over a long-term cost to the city. Is there any kind of total?
We can consider that point further in terms of submission on that point. Yeah.
It's going back to the infill with, you know, in parts of almost all the established areas, to infill those larger sections, if they're in flooded areas, we do have to put in those tanks to slow release water. So that also detracts from the space on the section. So that when we're talking of the infill 70 square metre Airbnb, what we call it granny flats, but let's be honest, most of them. Does that also include the area that the tanks, those slow release tanks?
Yeah, Mark said about footprint. Is it decks? Is it, what does it say?
So we're seeking some clarification on that 70 square metres maximum, and we'll ask that question around tanks.
All right, we're going to move on. Andre, did you? What's in general? Okay, good.
I don't know.
Yes,
Reason.
yes, I will speed through the five. Okay. So awesome. So the package 2 is a primary sector. So the amount of feedback we provided is significantly less than package 1, just to reflect the fact a lot of these areas and kind of our role as a territorial authority. A lot of these fall within regional authorities. So you'll see when get a submission, it's a lot lighter in terms of feedback. So in terms of the first instrument that we want to just flag, so it's relating to the National Environmental Standards for Commercial Forestry. So there's quite a lot of proposals, but in terms of our main submission point on this is one of the things that we're proposing to do is to repeal regulation 6.4a, and currently 6.4a gives councils discretion to set more stringent rules than the NES for commercial forestry in relation to afforestation. So we are opposing this on the basis that removing this regulation will likely limit our ability as the council to adequately manage risks associated with afforestation, namely wildfire risk. And we understand this is a key concern, and we have previously flagged this with central government, and we think it's worth coming out quite strongly given our previous concerns. Next kind of instrument is the NPS for highly productive land. So what they're proposing with this change is to remove the land use capability 3 parcels of land from the definition of highly productive land. We support this. We don't think it would have a significant impact in the Christchurch district. And we also note that there is a proposal here to remove the mapping, to either extend or suspend the mapping requirements for highly productive land, and we do not support that, and we think that should continue as is under the current timeframes, just because this mapping is actually what will help enable growth in some areas that are currently classified as LUC3.
So is this, can I just ask, is this work going to be a blanket policy across New Zealand? And the reason I ask that is if we say, oh, we would support that because it doesn't affect Christchurch,
but it's going to affect us getting potatoes from the Koei perhaps. Shouldn't we say, we don't care because it doesn't affect us? Should we add that we do care that it's going to affect other areas?
I mean, all of these are national instruments that apply countrywide, and it's how much you want to represent a view of concern for other parts of the country, or whether you.
Well, because if we say we're okay with it, so it doesn't affect us, that'll be a tick. Right, which is okay. So we're not really okay with losing versatile soils across New Zealand.
One of the proposals that they're also looking to establish is introducing what are called special agricultural areas as well. So that's to acknowledge areas, for example, the Koei or the Whenua, where there is highly productive land, and we would want to encourage primary production. So they're also consulting on options around how these special agricultural areas might also work. So we could consider maybe submitting on that point and making sure that there is enough productive land across the country in terms of getting.
So why is land use capabilities currently defined as highly productive land?
There's a classification from 1 to 10, and they've taken classes 1, 2, and 3 as being highly productive as an interim position. That the intent was that regional councils would then have to do mapping of highly productive land, having regard to a number of factors, including the extent to which sites are fragmented and other metrics. And the government's directions pause that is of concern, because at the moment it's treating highly productive land in a blanket way, saying all 1, 2, and 3 class land should be protected. We're saying it's more nuanced than that, and the regional council should continue the mapping.
3 will drop out the way that's.
That's proposed, and
Which is most of the land around appropriate Christchurch.
Most of the land around Christchurch is class 1 and 2.
I mean, close.
Sorry.
Yeah.
With modern food production, it needs literally any land anywhere can be highly productive land. Vertical farming, the Dutch have proved this, the Israelis have proved this, that you can just grow copious amounts of food on small amounts of land anywhere in the world.
There's certainly the diversification and innovation in the primary sector. I can't comment on the extent to which uses still rely on the soil. There are some rural productive activities.
Absolutely, you can, but we've got quite a lot across New Zealand. I think that's the purpose of this, is that having 500,000 people live close to Auckland is better value than Spuds, for instance.
So that's the driver behind at least reducing the impediments to growth by removing class 3 soils, and in doing so to enable broader uses of that land, including development of urban areas.
I don't feel comfortable.
It's not the on route.
We'll just keep going.
So the government's also consulting on a proposal in relation to the stock exclusion regulation. So currently there's a blanket ban for grazing in a wetland supporting threatened species, but now they're proposing to now allow non-intensively grazed deer and cattle to graze in a wetland supporting a threatened species. We do not support this. We think, given how few wetlands we have left, it's not. We think that even light grazing can have adverse impacts on fragile wetlands, and this is a problem we see primarily in high country in the South Island, and so it's better to take a maybe more localized approach for those particular, parcels of land where they're concerned that, these deer and cattle can't graze. In relation to the mining quarrying changes, so we just have a general kind of submission point around our concern that these proposed changes will lead to worse ecological outcomes due to a lesser test being proposed. So effectively, there are a number of, I won't go into detail, but there are a number of changes they're proposing to effectively lower the bar and make it easier, the gateway test easier to permit mining and quarrying activities.
We'll move it to freshwater management.
Does that include mining and quarrying activities in residential, not agricultural areas? Because I know we've got, quarries and things that are around the city where residents have concerns, groundwater, and those kind of things.
We'll check that.
Residents have expressed concern in the past.
Yeah, mine's similar to that. Thinking about the Aldhurst situation, or is most somebody different residential causing dust issues, that's major concern. So I'll make sure that the neighbours do, the setbacks are provided,
Your concerns are setback,
basically.
Samuel.
Yeah, it's probably along a similar vein, but a wee bit different. So the setback's obviously a challenge, but just trying to understand whether we're saying we're concerned about quarrying in general, because
It's not.
because that's not. I mean, where does that come from, and how have we formed that view? Because I would have thought unless I'm missing, I would have thought we need quarrying in terms of being able to actually sustain infrastructure.
It's not certainly not that position of opposing quarrying full stop. It's only in the context of wetlands that the point's made.
Right, so that'll be very clear.
We can make it clear.
Yeah, but it's different. I agree with you on the setback. What I'm saying is we can't blanketly say we're against quarrying, because you need quarrying to actually function as a society. Yeah,
Let's do it about live.
there's so I was feel sure around the setbacks. So if we don't have quarrying, we don't have infrastructure.
Close to the point.
Yeah. Exactly.
Carry on. Time is marching on, ladies.
Okay, sorry, so we have a lot of content on the slide, but just in the interest of time, I will just summarize our position, just so we can as much discussion as possible. So effectively, they're looking to change, just before we get started, we don't actually have the actual draft provisions in relation to freshwater management. So this is the first stage of the consultation. The government will be coming out later in the year with actual detailed provisions. So what we're providing is feedback on high level options. So you will see that we don't have a lot of detail sometimes specifically around the changes. It's just more, do we agree with the general position or not? So in terms of the freshwater package, the first thing they're consulting on is whether to rebalance freshwater management through multiple objectives. So currently we have the current hierarchy, which you can read here, with one single objective. On the second bullet point, so that's the current hierarchy. Our preference is to retain a single objective in the MPS-FM, and we consider that the current objective is adequate, clear, and already provides for community social, cultural, and economic well-being. And we don't necessarily think that having these multiple objectives will actually make it easier to apply the MPS-FM, particularly where there are conflicts between these proposed objectives. So the second one, and this is probably one where we really value your feedback, is in terms of rebalancing Te Mana or Te Wai. So you can see here in the box that they've got three options that they're proposing in terms of how we could rebalance the framework. So our strong preference is to keep the current Te Mana or Te Wai framework from 2020 and retain the hierarchy, although we would clarify the obligation around drinking water in the second obligation. And we don't really support any of the three options. We note that in the regulatory impact statement, the recommended option didn't actually make it to public consultation, but we think it's worth exploring that option again because that recommended option in the RIS retains three components of the 2020 Te Mana o Te Wai concept, with some amendments to improve clarity for implementation and interpretation. But acknowledging that there are three options provided in the discussion document, if we had to, I guess, choose one of the options, we would recommend choosing option one because it does retain probably the most from the 2020 framework compared with the other two options. And in terms of option three, we think that's completely, we don't think that's one that we should be entertaining because
I think we should choose an option.
Yeah. But our strong preference is to say that we don't support any of them. Yeah. In terms of the next topic, so there's currently a national objectives framework that kind of supports Te Mana o Te Wai. So maybe in the interest of time, I won't explain all of it unless you'd like me, or should we just skip?
And we'll be circulating the draft submission to you later today. So perhaps if there's questions or comments you've got on the specifics, we can traverse that offline.
Yeah, but I guess our headline submission point on the proposed changes to the national objective framework is that we don't think national bottom lines should be optional or flexible. We think that they're really important to maintain the quality of freshwater, and so allowing kind of leeway in terms of how many compulsory attributes values we have, we think actually there's a bit of a slippery slope and actually could lead to worse freshwater outcomes. So very quickly, in terms of the proposals to simplify wetland provisions, so they are proposing to introduce a new permitted activity standard for activities related to wetland construction, so making it easier to construct a wetland. So we support these proposals, and it also will make it easier for the council to also construct a wetland when needed. There's also another proposal to introduce a new permitted activity standard for farming activities unlikely to have an adverse effect on a wetland, but because we haven't seen the provisions, we can't really assess whether it's a good or bad proposal, acknowledging that even kind of activities like fencing might not seem like they have an adverse impact, but they actually, in many cases, could actually have an impact. And I might just skip the fish passage because it's not that.
What was the fish passage?
So they're looking to streamline information requirements in terms of the fish passage requirements in the NES for freshwater. So we don't support it because we think actually some of the information that they've highlighted is not important, like water velocity is actually quite important for designing fish passage. And we're also concerned that I guess reducing or streamlining requirements might make it easier to not provide fish passage in certain cases where it's needed. So it's just a kind of wanting to make sure that fish passage is provided for, and as long as needed, even where there's like a temporary activity that disturbs the fish passage.
Those are the same passage is not.
You're making it a bit easier.
Yeah. And so they're also consulting on whether, because currently temporary, my understanding is that temporary culverts are treated as permanent ones under the framework, and basically they're wanting now to have a new permitted activity standard for temporary culverts and retain the one permanent culverts, but some of the activities like construction can go on for 10 years, for example, in which case there's a question around how long is temporary. So it is quite technical, specific passage, but I think, our main kind of concern is we just don't want to lower the bar for fish passage, and just to make sure that it can stay as long as needed. Yep. And we might just skip this slide, I guess, in the interest of time.
What?
Yeah.
Slide.
Oh,
The nitrogen one.
would you like? Okay, we can go quickly over that one.
It's incredibly
Okay. So effectively, there are a number of changes the government are proposing in relation to addressing the rules for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So there are a few kind of proposed changes around the reporting requirements and things like removing the need for farmers to provide receipts. But there is one proposal that there was a consulting on, which is to remove the cap of 190 kilograms per hectare of the fertilizer, and we do not support this because we believe that the cap is there for a reason, and obviously removing the cap might potentially lead to worse freshwater outcomes. So that's sort of our high-level sort of submission point on that. And the drinking water mapping requirements is just quite a small section, but it's just to say that we support mapping of these.
was mentioning that we value our for water, nitrogen leaching.
Something like the last one, just next steps, and then we've got one question and a chatting, and that's all. Sorry, Oh, you're one. No, you were at the start.
Oh, yeah, I'm here, one.
Yeah, right.
He's waited patiently.
Right, we're over time. Carry on, please.
It's a good one.
No, come on.
I can just say that any written feedback's welcome. Happy to meet one-to-one or collectively again, but we'll bring it to finance performance on the 23rd ahead of the submission due date of 21st.
Okay, Yanni, please.
You're okay, man. I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you, buddy.
Oh, time's up.
100.
Thank you. Just before, it'd be really good to get some advice on what this, where this might make things easier for council. So, for example, we've got a stack of plan changes we need to do, have to throw massive resources at them. Like, will this new RMA make it any easier for us to do things like plan changes? That would be a really good thing. So to be supporting something like that in our submission if it does, or if it doesn't, that's the kind of feedback we should be providing. It's easier for us.
So Brett very briefly touched on it at the start of infrastructure. Seeking more is included within the definition of infrastructure may assist with consenting processes and so forth. In terms of the plan change program, which the team leaders will talk through shortly, a lot of these changes are tied up with matters that are beyond the scope of those plan changes, namely primary sector and freshwater. Even infrastructure is not widely impacting on that program of plan changes. So central city noise, there's nothing in here that will assist us per se, but Sarah can talk about some of what's coming in the replacements of the RMA, which may signal some direction to what we need to consider.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for talk to us.
Thank you.